Okay, so we're going to continue with going through Exodus 32 through 34. So we finished, as you remember, on verse 14. So what I'll do is I'll tell you the verses we're going to cover, and then if you wanted to read them before I go in depth, you can just pause the video and then keep going. So we're going to talk about verses 15 through 35 of Exodus 32. So we saw the sin that happened in verses 1 through 6, then Moses' mediation in 7 through 14, and then 15 through 35 are the consequences of the sin of the Israelites with the golden calf. So what happens is, as Moses comes down the mountain, he smashes the tablets that God had given him, and what this does is this indicates that the covenant has been broken. So the people had made the covenant with God, and then just a few chapters later, they've already broken it by making this image an explicit violation of what God had said. So Moses smashes the tablets, and then he grinds up the golden calf into powder, and he makes the people drink it, which is a little odd, but that's what the story says. And then in verses 21 through 24, Moses interrogates Aaron. He talks to him about what exactly happened while he was gone. And in verse 21, Moses says this to Aaron: "What did this people do to you that you have brought such a great sin upon them?" So Moses is assuming with this question that Aaron made the golden calf under threat of the people. Now, having read the story, of course, already, we know that that's not exactly what happened. So Moses doesn't have all the information that we have as readers. So then who does Aaron blame for it? And we see that in the next verse, where Aaron says, "Let not the anger of my Lord burn hot. You know the people, and that they are set on evil. For they said to me, 'Make us gods who shall go before us.' As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." So Aaron blames the people for what he's done. He says that they're set on evil. They demanded that he made gods. Now, as a reader, the question is, do we believe him? And it's obvious that we don't, right? Because we've already read that the people demand, or they actually just ask Aaron to make the golden calf, and Aaron does it. He offers no resistance to it. He just makes it. Plus, we know the next verse in 24 is humorous in some ways. So Aaron says, "So I said to them, 'Let any who have gold take it off.' So they gave it to me, and I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf." So Aaron makes it this idea of, hey, they gave me all their gold and jewelry, and I threw it in, and then bam, out popped an idol. But having read earlier, it says very clearly in 32 verse 4, "He received the gold from their hand, and he fashioned it with a graving tool." So we know Aaron didn't just throw it in the fire and it came out. We've already read that he took great care in making it. So we are not inclined as a reader to believe Aaron at all in this situation. So this actually negatively characterizes Aaron here. And there's an interesting comparison that you can make between Aaron and Moses, whereas Moses is with God up on the mountain. Moses is righteously angry when he sees that the people have already forsaken God. But Aaron, as we saw even before that, he just quickly capitulated to the people. He gave in, he fashions this golden calf, and then he pretty much lies about it to Moses as to how it went down. So an overview, you have to remember we're going through the three crises in this account. So this is the first crisis, where there's the sin, mediation, and consequences of their sin. So the account of the making of the golden calf presumes, of course, that we've already read 25 through 31 about the tabernacle. So we already know that God has given Moses the instructions for building the tabernacle so that his presence can be with them. And since the tabernacle is to function as God's residence, his place of dwelling with the Israelites, the construction of the idol in this situation to be a manifestation of God's presence it's completely unnecessary, because they don't need an idol to function as Yahweh for them, because God is already telling Moses how he's going to dwell with them. If he follows the directions of the tabernacle, God will come dwell with them. So they don't need to build an image. God has already told them not to do that. They don't need to build it because God is going to come dwell with them, but on his terms, not on theirs. So that's the conclusion of crisis one, at least, is there's the sin, Moses mediates for them, and then there's the consequences. Then crisis 2 comes in 33, 1 through 6. So you can read that. But what has changed here in God's plan is what we need to ask. So I won't read the passages, but God has basically said he will not go up with the people anymore. He won't go up with them to the land that he promised to Abraham, Isaac, and to Jacob. And so the motif of God's presence becomes a central issue here in 33. So if God's presence will not be with them, then it also places in doubt the need for the tabernacle. Because if God's not going to be with them, he doesn't need a place to dwell. So that's what's changed so far, is there's an absence. God is saying he's not going to go with them, and then there's going to be further mediation for his presence later on in the chapter. So 33, 7 through 11, though, we've talked about, there's a bit of an interlude that takes place. So there's a pause, and it talks about how God used to meet with Moses to give him instructions. Narratively, what this does for us is this diffuses the tension of the narrative. So we've had increased tension where the people sin, there's consequences. Now God has said that he's not going to go up with the people. And then this aside, so this takes place, 33, 7 through 11, is something that's taken place before and what takes place later, how God communicates to Moses. So what this does as a reader is this kind of ramps the tension down for us a little bit, so that we can then move on to finish what has already started. So in 33, 12 through 17, then Moses is responding to what God has told him in verses 1 through 6. So what is the key thing then that Moses is asking for here? First, what he's asking for is to know God's way. So what that means is he's asking what God's immediate plans are for the people. What does God plan to do? And then he's also, the second thing he's asking for is for God to go up with them. So he basically says, God, you have to go up with us, otherwise there's no real point in us going. On what basis, though, does he make this request? So these are just questions that we're going through in your handout. He makes his basis of this request on, number one, on the grace that God has given to him. So he mentions that if I have found favor in your sight, so it's another word for grace. So God has already given Moses lots of grace in the sense of he's called him to represent his people. He's listened to Moses' intercession. So the first reason that Moses asks for God to come up with him is on the basis of the grace God has given to them. The second basis is that God has set Israel apart as his people, as distinct from all other nations of the world. And so God has to go up with them, basically. So then does God answer this? And we see clearly in the text that yes, he says that he will go up with them, in fact. But there's still a problem in 33 verse 3 that's talked about, and that's their rebellion. So the rebellion of the Israelites, and it's contrasted with God's holiness. And so this highlights for the reader, and this highlights for us that there's an incompatibility between the sin of the Israelites and the holiness of God. So this needs to be fixed somehow, because God in his holiness, if he goes up with the sinful Israelites, he will destroy them, because it's incompatible for a holy God to be with a sinful people. So that's what the third crisis then helps us see. So this is in 34, 1 through 4. So the first step that needs to take place after Moses has interceded for them is that there needs to be new tablets. So the covenant was broken, and so there needs to be, the covenant needs to basically either be reestablished or just done away with entirely. So the old ones were broken, representing a broken covenant. And so new tablets imply the renewal of the covenant. So when God gives Moses new tablets, God is saying he's not abandoning Israel, he's reestablishing his covenant with them. Then in 34, 6 through 7, God's glory is revealed. And so what we want to see is there's an interesting contrast between Exodus chapter 20, verses 4 through 6, and Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 through 7. So it'd be helpful to have you read both of those passages so you could see and then note any differences that you see. A few of the differences I would want to highlight. There's several, but the first one is there's a reversal between the two passages of God showing love and punishing wrongdoing. So, for example, or what I mean by that is, in chapter 20, verse 5, towards the end, it says that God will visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. So the first thing you have there is God punishing evil and then also him showing love. In chapter 34, though, it's actually the opposite, where God declares himself as merciful, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. So you have God showing his love and grace. And then second, you have him mentioning visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. So you have, they're flipped. In chapter 20, the punishing the guilty is first, then love is second. Whereas in 34, love is first and punishing the guilty is second. So there's a priority in chapter 34 given to divine forgiveness. The reason I think this is there is because it paves the way for the renewing of the covenant that God is doing right here. So he's punished the guilty in some ways, and so here when God renews the covenant, it's highlighting his love, which is why I think it's first. There's also, we have to keep in mind when you think about this, that divine love and divine punishment must be held in balance. We can't give priority necessarily to one over the other because they're both part of God's character. If we emphasize one to the exclusion of the other, it's where we run into problems. Also, the other main difference here is that 34, 6-7 speaks of God being faithful, merciful, gracious, and slow to anger, which is not in chapter 20. So you have this major highlight in chapter 34, or this part of chapter 34, 6-7, on God's love, on God being slow to anger, being gracious and merciful, which is not in chapter 20. So, in light of the Israelites' idolatry, the renewing of the covenant depends entirely on God's willingness to forgive in spite of their defiant rebellion. So that's why this is highlighted here, that God forgives them and he reestablishes his covenant with them. Then in 34, 9-10, we have another prayer of Moses, where he ties together his request for God's presence with and pardon from sin. So he mentions again that the people are stiff-necked, and that's the key problem that God has stated that we've seen, is will God pardon a people who are stiff-necked like the Israelites? And God says yes in verse 10. He will create something new from the situation that has never before been seen. And so that helps us see that a central concern of 32-34, these three chapters, is on sin and forgiveness. So 32 starts with the sin of the Israelites. 33 and 34 then start bringing up the idea of God's presence and God's forgiveness. Because the question naturally arises later, especially as Israel is living under the Mosaic covenant, is when Israel sins, is this the end of the covenant? And if it's not, then on what terms can the covenant be renewed and continue? And chapter 34 gives us the answer to that, is that it lies entirely in God's character, that the covenant can be renewed and continue even when Israel sins, because they receive grace and mercy that they don't deserve. But it's part of God's very character that he's gracious, merciful. And so as an overview of these three chapters, rather, the questions just to consider is, what do we learn about sin and idolatry from these chapters? What situation for the Israelites produced temptation? What was their goal? How did they go about trying to achieve their goal, and what was the problem for them? And so the themes here in these three chapters they're linked by the theme of God's presence. So the events of 33 through 34 provide a resolution to the problem created by the idolatrous worship rather, that God would need to remove his presence from them because of their idolatrous worship. But God doesn't, because of his gracious and compassionate nature. So the problem that's started in chapter 32 is then answered in 33 through 34. So that at least finishes up our session on 32 through 34, and then we'll move into talking about the